Hey everyone, Tactics here with another video taking a closer look at tanks in Shadowlands, this time focusing on Blood Death Knights. In particular, we'll look at their new and regained spells, how their talents are shaping up, their top legendaries, how Covenants, Soulbinds, and Conduits are looking, as well as how they're stacking up in both Raids and Mythic Plus. If you're interested in watching my other tank videos, you can check out the links in the description. Also, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you like and subscribe to be notified when I post more Warcraft content, and let's jump straight into the video, starting with how the unpruning affected blood DKs. Probably the biggest gain for all DKs in Shadowlands is the return of Anti-Magic Zone, a raid-wide cooldown that grants allies who stand inside it a 20% DR to magic damage, which is looking to be solid against both the prideful seasonal affix as well as many raid bosses. All DKs now also have access to Lichborn Baseline, which grants a small leech boost, but more importantly makes you immune to charm, fears, and sleep effects. The combo of Raise Dead and Sacrificial Pack is also available to all Death Knights, allowing you to have a ghoul up for 60 seconds every 2 minutes, with the option to sacrifice it to deal AoE damage and heal you. In addition, Death Coil is baseline for all DKs, but for Blood this is likely something you don't want on your bars. In terms of blood-specific changes, both Ossuary and Runetap talents are now baseline, with Runetap no longer being on the GCD. They also got a bunch of new rune forges, but this doesn't really matter for Blood, as Fallen Crusader is still shaping up to be the best option. Moving on to talents, let's start at the beginning. For the level 15 row, Runestrike has been removed, and in its place is Tombstone. This unfortunately is still pretty much a never pick talent, with a choice being between Heartbreaker for 2+ targets or Blood Drinker for single target. The level 25 row is largely unchanged, with Rapid Decomposition gaining an additional effect in causing your Blood Plague to leech 50% more health, and Consumption being target capped at 8, but having its cooldown reduced to 30 seconds from 45, and healing increased to 150% of damage dealt, up from 100%. Not much has really changed on this row regardless of the buffs, as the damage benefit from Rapid Decomposition is negligible at best, and Consumption is still just barely stronger than Blood Boil with mediocre total healing. In pretty much every situation, Hemostasis is the go-to talent on this row. Next up, we've got the level 30 row, which has been shaken up a bit. With Ossuary now baseline, Blood Tap is making an appearance in its place, and in Tombstone's old spot, a new talent, Relish in Blood, is available, which causes your Crimson Scourge procs to cause Death and Decay to heal you based on the number of Bone Shield charges you have, and grant you 10 runic power. Overall, Foul Bulwark is still a fairly useless talent, so the choice becomes between Relish in Blood and Blood Tap. Overall, I'd say that Blood Tap is the superior choice in all cases if used correctly, as it gives you a lot more control of your resources. However, if used incorrectly, I would definitely take Relish in Blood, so especially for new players, I would recommend taking Relish in Blood over Blood Tap. The level 35 row has also seen quite a few changes, with the buffed Mark of Blood taking the place of the now baseline Rune Tap, which now causes attacks to heal for 3% of the target's max health and has had its runic power cost removed. This is now much less terrible than it's been in the past, and is an alright survivability increase in 1 to 2 target scenarios where you can keep the debuff up at 100% uptime, but in general it has a hard time competing with Rill of the Necropolis. Anti-Magic Barrier also got a buff, reducing the cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell by 20 seconds up from 15, and increasing its duration absorbed by 40% up from 30%. This is still going to be an extremely situational talent and won't find much use. Will of the Necropolis remains the go-to in Shadowlands, as it helps to reduce your health spiking too much, essentially providing you with a defensive cooldown at low health when you need it the most. The level 40 row is the exact same as before, where Grip of the Dead is the go-to in dungeons to allow for kiting, and Wraithwalk is the go-to in raids for more mobility. Tightening Grasp is the more situational talent, or if you really need to pump out more mass grips, but most likely it won't be picked too often. Moving on to the level 45 row, Death Pact is now available to Blood Death Knights, which heals you for 50% of your max HP, but puts a healing absorb on you for 30% of your max HP. While this is an okay panic button, especially for the DPS DK specs, I think the drawbacks of this talent for Blood outweigh the benefits. Voracious saw a pretty significant buff as well, now also increasing Deathstrike's healing by 20% on top of having the 15% leech buff extended from 8 seconds from 6. It also has some pretty solid synergy with a legendary, which we'll talk about in the next section. Finally, Bloodworms is still a great set it and forget it talent, which provides the highest damage on this row and does a decent amount of healing. Generally, I think the choice will be between Voracious and Bloodworms, depending on if you need the additional healing from Voracious or not. Last up, we've got the level 50 row, which has only seen a couple minor changes, in Bone Storm being target capped at 8, and Red Thirst having its cooldown reduction increased to 1.5 seconds per 10 runic power, up from 1. Not much has changed here, where Bone Storm is still the go-to talent at Mythic Plus for a solid burst of damage and healing on a short cooldown, and Purgatory is still the go-to for raiding, especially during progression, as having access to a cheat death effect is incredibly valuable. Red Thirst is definitely the weakest of the bunch, though it does have some legendary synergies. Unfortunately, neither of those legendaries are particularly strong, and with Red Thirst having to compete with two very strong talents, it makes it more difficult to justify taking advantage of those synergies. Next on the list is Legendaries. Unfortunately, there's really only a couple decent ones for Blood Death Knights to choose from, one being a DK General Legendary and the other being a Blood Specific Legendary. Starting with the General Legendary, we have Super Strain, which causes your Blood Plague to also apply Virulent Plague and Frost Fever to the target at reduced effectiveness. This provides the best offense by far and also gives a slight defensive boost via the runic power generation from Frost Fever. There's not really much else to say about this legendary, as you'll just passively keep it up with Blood Plague by doing your rotation, so this just adds some more free passive damage and runic power generation. Moving on to the best Blood Specific legendary, we have Bryndior's, which causes Death Strike to refund you 15% of the runic power spent if it heals you for more than 10% of your max health. This isn't too hard to trigger, especially when used alongside the Voracious talent, resulting in this legendary being a pretty consistent source of runic power, which in turn allows you to pump out even more Death Strikes. From there, we have a few lackluster Blood legendaries. First, there's Gorefiend's Domination, which causes Heartstrike to reduce the cooldown of Vampiric Blood by 2 seconds, which when combined with the Red Thirst talent can result in some pretty significant cooldown reduction, but again you have to give up a fantastic raid option in Purgatory or a fantastic Mythic Plus option in Bone Storm in order to take advantage of these synergies. Vampiric Aura is another meh legendary, granting 50% of Vampiric Blood effect to your party members. This pretty much only has uses for if group healing throughput is a problem when pushing higher Mythic Plus keys, but even then it's unlikely you'd see a lot of DKs in this scenario, and oftentimes groups will come up with other solutions via consumables or personal defensives. Lastly, there's Crimson Rune Weapon, which causes consumed Bone Shield charges to reduce the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon by 3 seconds, and grants you 40% increased rune regeneration for 10 seconds after Dancing Rune Weapon expires. Unfortunately, Dancing Rune Weapon is a fairly lackluster cooldown in general, and aside from this legendary granting more uses of a lackluster cooldown, the big benefit comes from the increased rune regeneration, which comes after the use of Dancing Rune Weapon, which is normally after you would want it, so this definitely hurts the value of the effect slightly. Next up, we've got Covenants and Soulbinds. Starting off with the Kyrians, all players gain access to Phial of Serenity, which is basically an additional health potion that also removes all curses, diseases, poisons, and bleeds. This is quite useful on a tank in Mythic Plus, as it can eliminate bleeds as well as debuffs that your healer can't. And it's decent in raids as well thanks to the bleed removal, though it has been diminished recently with certain boss effects no longer being flagged as bleeds. Having an additional health potion as a last resort panic button is always helpful as well. In addition to Phial, Death Knights gain Shackle the Unworthy, which is a 14-second debuff on a 1-minute cooldown that deals arcane damage and reduces the target damage dealt to you by 5%. This can be spread to other nearby targets as well when attacking them with rune-spending direct damage abilities. While not the greatest and pure single target scenarios, when there are multiple targets this can spread to, it can be quite strong, and it has a little bit of a ramp up time for Mythic Plus, but overall it spreads fairly quickly. If you are able to chain pull, it also gains even more value as it can spread from pack to pack without needing to recast it. Regarding Soulbinds, Kyrians really only have one decent option for Blood in Pelagos, though he is exceptionally strong. He offers a mastery buff tied to Shackle the Unworthy and a stacking versatility buff which is quite easy to keep at the cap of 5%. While mastery isn't the greatest stat for Blood DKs, the versatility boost is very nice to have. Pelagos also has a cooldown reduction on Phial on kills, which is a nice boost for Mythic Plus. Outside of Pelagos, the options aren't too great, with Clea having a very crit-focused tree with a party heal tied to you and your group's critical strikes, as well as a passive boost to your crit based on nearby enemies and allies. She can also transform Phial into a preventative ability, causing it to make you immune to curses, diseases, poisons, and bleeds for 8 seconds after using it. Last up is Mechanicos, who allows you to summon a Brawn after using 90 spells or abilities, though this does knock back on summon, which can be annoying in dungeons. He can also make your Phial automatically trigger when you fall below 35% health, which isn't great if you're saving it for a certain debuff, or he can attach a knockback to it, which again can be annoying in Mythic Plus as you normally aren't taking mob position into account when thinking about when you're using your Phial. He does provide a strong haste buff when hitting a new enemy, which is great in Mythic Plus, but this one positive doesn't really outweigh the lack of other good tank abilities. Overall, Kyrian has a very powerful Soulbind in Pelagos and is solid in raids, but with the recent bleed changes I think it loses a fair amount of value, making it second to Night Fae. For Mythic Plus, they can shine in multi-target scenarios where Shackle is able to spread, but again I think this is outshined slightly by Venthyr, which leaves Kyrian as a decent middle ground choice for both raids and Mythic Plus. Following Kyrians, we have the Necrolords, who provide its members with the Fleshcraft ability, which grants an absorb shield that is more powerful if used next to an enemy corpse. They also provide Death Knights with the Abomination Limb ability, which deals AoE shadow damage, it grips an enemy to you every second for 12 seconds, and grants you 3 Bone Shield charges on the first grip. Unfortunately, while very cool, this ability isn't very good in PvE, as the damage is a bit lacking compared to other options, it doesn't provide very much in terms of survivability, and in content like Mythic Plus, it can occasionally troll you a bit and pull mobs you aren't in combat with. Overall, this is definitely the worst ability combo for Blood Death Knights. Looking at their Soulbinds, they don't really overcome the poor Covenant abilities. Merilith provides you with small 6-minute buffs based on the type of creature you use Fleshcraft on, which are nice little boosts, but often you don't have much control over the creature type in dungeons or raids, so this could result in you being stuck with unattractive buffs such as a 2% mastery from humanoids, which reduces this trait's value a bit. Merilith does provide a strong healing boost and a 15% max health absorb shield once every 30 seconds when you fall below 50% health, which should proc quite often in both Mythic Plus and raids and will therefore provide a significant amount of value. Unfortunately, his final ability Ultimate Form isn't terribly strong, granting you CC immunity and health regeneration during and for 4 seconds after channeling Fleshcraft. Amini isn't a better option, though he does have a strong effect in Lead by Example, which provides you and your party members a primary stat buff tied to Abomination Limb. Outside of this effect, however, there are only a couple weaker options in a 5% max health buff tied to Fleshcraft, and a short haste buff after defeating enemy, which is alright in Mythic Plus, but not as good as Mechanicos' version. Bonesmith isn't a great option either, providing a pseudo-cheat death that allows you to fight for 10 seconds after dying at 50% effectiveness, a Thorns-like effect for melee attackers, and the choice between a crit buff once per 60 seconds or a percent max health healing 6 seconds after killing an enemy, neither of which is very enticing. In the end, while Necrolords have a great aesthetic for DKs, their ability is by far the weakest of the bunch for PvE, with no real place in either raids or Mythic Plus. They also have some poor Soulbind options, which when put together makes them the worst overall choice for Blood. Moving on, we have the Night Fae, every Death Knight's favorite butterfly fairies. They grant the Soul Shape ability, which provides the player with multiple blinks and a move speed increase for 12 seconds, which gives DKs some much needed mobility. They also grant all Death Knights the Death's Due ability, which replaces Death and Decay and causes your Heart Strikes to put a stacking damage reduction on enemies from 1% capped at 8%, as well as stealing an equal amount of strength. This ability now stacks much slower than it did initially, making it not nearly as strong in content like Mythic Plus, where the pulls don't usually last long enough to stack up the debuff and gain full value. However, in raids it is quite easy to maintain max stacks on bosses. If we look at their Soulbinds, they have some decent options, particularly for raids. Naya is probably the worst of the bunch, providing a mastery and max health buff tied to Death's Due. However, you struggle to build up stacks to increase the strength of this buff as you recast Death's Due very often thanks to Crimson Scourge. She can also reduce the cooldown of Soul Shape based on enemies defeated, which is decent in Mythic Plus, but doesn't do too much for raids. Lastly, she can make your interrupts deal damage to the target, which again doesn't have too much use in raids, but is decent in Mythic Plus. Moving on to Dreamweaver, we see some fantastic raid options. She provides Pod Tender, which is another cheat death effect, though it puts the player in a pod that must be defended for 10 seconds, so while this isn't great in Mythic Plus, it's pretty good in raid scenarios. She can also provide a short versatility buff that bounces between yourself and 2 allies, as well as a short haste buff tied to Death's Due and a location, which again you can have some decent uptype on thanks to the cooldown resets of Crimson Scourge. Last up, we've got Corrin, who increases your damage against targets above 75% health and your healing to targets below 35% health by 10%. This damage boost is solid in dungeons, but not too great in raids as the damage is usually just pad, though the healing boost is nice in all forms of content as it gives a solid boost to your most important death strikes. He also provides a choice between 2 strong defensive traits in Face Your Foes and Hold the Line, where the former causes your abilities to decrease the damage of targets in front of you by 3%, and the latter causes you to take 15% less physical damage after standing still for 5 seconds, which could be great in some raid fights that lack movement while actively tanking. Overall, I think Night Fae are an extremely good raid option thanks to the longer fights allowing them to get full value out of their Death's Due stacks, as well as a great Soulbind trait from Dreamweaver. They definitely fall behind a bit in Mythic Plus, as Death's Due rarely has time to fully stack up, and there are better options available in both Kyrian and Venthyr. Speaking of the Venthyr, they're up next, granting the Door of Shadows ability, which is a short teleport on a 1-minute cooldown that has a 1.5 second cast time. This ability was originally thought to be potentially game-breaking, but in practice it has been anything but, not giving access to any impactful skips in Mythic Plus, and even if it did, it's often easier to have a rogue in push groups to enable such skips, rather than make all 5 party members Venthyr. Death Knights specifically also gain access to Swarming Mist, which is a 1-minute cooldown that grants you 10% dodge for 8 seconds, and deals uncapped AoE damage to enemies within 10 yards every second, also providing you with 3 runic power per enemy hit each second, up to a cap of 15 runic power per second. This is a huge amount of runic power when used against multiple enemies, which makes it extremely powerful in Mythic Plus, but can mean it struggles in Raid. Also, with the current threat problems a lot of tanks are having in dungeons, it grants another short damage cooldown Death Knights can use alongside Bone Storm that can be alternated between to reduce threat issues. Alongside their strong Mythic Plus abilities, Venthyr also has some strong Soulbinds for Mythic Plus. Starting with Nadia, Thrillseeker grants a strong haste buff that procs more often when killing enemies, making it very good in Mythic Plus. She also provides a flat 20% boost to your food, flask, and weapon enchants, which does affect Death Knight weapon runes, making this a strong passive boost to things you always have up when doing relevant content. Theotar is an alright option as well, granting a decent sized mastery buff approximately once per minute, as well as having the choice between a party versatility buff tied to Swarming Mist, or a 100 to 200% increase in combat potion length, which is a little bit RNG but can be especially strong when using potions inside of burst windows such as Bloodlust or the Prideful buff. Lastly, there's Draven, who provides a buff similar to Will of the Necropolis, decreasing your damage taken below 40% health by 10%, which is a fantastic defensive boost. He also attaches a 15% max health absorb to your Door of Shadows, giving it some use if you don't need the teleport. Finally, he has Hold Your Ground, which gives you a stamina and healing done buff if you stand still for 4 seconds, but this buff persists for 6 seconds after moving, making it usable even in situations where there's a lot of movement. To conclude, Venthyr is looking like the strongest option in Mythic Plus, thanks to the runic power and threat generation of Swarming Mists, as well as the strong Soulbinds. It falls behind a bit in rating though, as both the Night Fae and Kyrian appear to be better options as of now. Now that we've talked Covenants and Soulbinds, let's move on to Conduits. As with other classes and specs, each Covenant has a potency conduit that buffs their class ability, and these tend to be the best options. For Kyrians, this buffs the damage done by Shackle the Unworthy by 20 to 48% depending on rank, and increases its duration by 3 seconds. Necrolords just give a flat 15 to 36% damage increase to Abomination Limb, and similarly, Night Faes give a flat 50 to 120% damage increase to Death's Due. Finally, Venthyr's cause Swarming Mist to grant 3% more dodge, and increases its damage by 12.5 to 30.5%. In general, while most of these effects are just boring percent damage increases, they are still quite effective. In terms of other potency options, Debilitating Malady is a bit lackluster, which causes Blood Boil to increase the damage enemies take from your Blood Plague by 1 to 2.4% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Overall, Blood Plague doesn't do a ton of your damage in most scenarios, and requires a bit of ramp up time to get up to max stacks, which can make it a poor option in Mythic Plus. It's okay in raids as it's fairly easy to maintain 3 stacks on a target over a long period of time, but it's still just a fairly small damage increase overall. The other potency option is Withering Plague, which causes Heartstrike to deal 15 to 36% additional damage to enemies infected by your Blood Plague, which should be up pretty much all the time. That pretty much just makes this a flat damage boost to your Heartstrike, and since this damage boost is higher than the damage boost granted by Debilitating Malady, it beats it out in pretty much all situations. Moving on to finesse options, there are 3 that could see some use. First, there's Chilled Resilience, which reduces the cooldown of Icebound Fortitude by 20 to 48 seconds depending on rank, which is just a nice boost if you need a little bit more cooldown uptime. There's also Fleeting Wind, which gives you an additional 15 to 36% move speed for the first 3 seconds of Death Advance, great if you need a little bit more mobility in raids. Finally, there's Spirit Drain, which causes successful interrupts to grant 10 to 24 runic power, which is actually extremely powerful in Mythic Plus, where you'll be interrupting quite often. And for those of you where Mythic Plus is your preferred content, this is actually shaping up to be one of the best options for Blood DKs, period. Last up, let's look at the endurance options, which are unfortunately a bit lacking. Blood Bond causes Rune Tap to heal you and your party members for 2 to 4.8% of your max health when used, which isn't terrible, but Blood Tap is a proactive form of mitigation, whereas a self-heal is a reactive form of mitigation, so combining the two together is a little bit clunky and could result in lost value from overhealing. Continuing with lackluster options, Insatiable Appetite increases Deathstrike's minimum healing by 1 to 2.4%, which is an interesting choice. It really doesn't provide much value at all, as more often than not in higher end content your Deathstrike isn't going to be doing the minimum healing, so there's no real point in ever using this conduit under any circumstance. Continuing on the train of mediocrity, Meat Shield increases the duration of Dancing Rune Weapon by 3 seconds and causes it to make your parries increase your health by 2 to 4.8% for 15 seconds, stacking twice. This kind of falls into the same problem as the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary, where it buffs a not so great cooldown in a way that doesn't make it good, it just makes it slightly less bad. This just seems like another option that won't be taken. Slowly moving towards a better option, there's Reinforced Shell, which increases AMZ's radius by 15% and duration by 2 to 4.8 seconds. This is a pretty sizable duration increase and nothing to scoff at. If this additional time actually allows AMZ to block more instances of raid or party-wide magic damage during boss fights or things like Prideful, it could be quite useful to have. Last up for endurance conduits, we have Hardened Bones, which makes Lichborne into a better defensive cooldown, adding a 6 to 14.2% damage reduction to it. This, in addition to the leech it provides, makes it a nice little defensive, and while this conduit won't have the greatest uptime as Lichborne is just a 10-second buff on a 2-minute cooldown, it's certainly better than most if not all of the other endurance options. Now what does all this mean for Blood DKs in raids and Mythic Plus? Starting in raids, Blood DKs are an absolutely fantastic position. With the return of AMZ, they now bring a powerful raid cooldown, and Castle Nathria is absolutely full of magic damage, so this will be an extremely important ability to have. In addition to this, Blood DKs have some of the best self-sustain of any tank, which tends to be extremely important early on in the expansion when tanks tend to get trucked and healer throughput can be a problem. These factors, combined with the multitude of small cooldowns Blood DKs have access to, especially with Rune Tap now being baseline, makes them quite strong in raid tanking situations. When it comes to Mythic Plus, Blood DKs are very hit and miss. Their strong self-sustain again is very important and a huge boon, and AMZ actually has plenty of uses thanks to the new seasonal affix Prideful. They also have great mob control with things like Death Grip and Gorfine's Grasp, but unfortunately as you move up higher key levels, the large amount of consistent physical damage can be a problem. This can lead to Blood DKs feeling quite squishy in higher keys and puts them near the bottom of tanks in high Mythic Plus. Note that if you don't plan on going much higher than a plus 15, I would say Blood is perfectly fine and is even one of the stronger Mythic Plus options. In the end, Blood DKs gain some solid baseline abilities in Shadowlands with things like AMZ, Rune Tap, and Ossuary. While they have some uninspiring legendary options, they have fantastic self-sustain, and with access to a powerful raid cooldown now, it makes them extremely strong in raid environments. Unfortunately, their lack of passive tankiness does hurt them when pushing higher keys, as they can feel quite squishy outside of their defensives. They are also a bit lacking in the damage department, which can lead to some threat issues, though this can partially be solved by the Venthyr Covenant ability by alternating your uses of Bone Storm and Swarming Mists. But that wraps up this video taking a closer look at Blood, Death Knights, and Shadowlands. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure you like and subscribe to be notified when I post more Warcraft content. I am currently working on videos for all of the tank specs, as well as dungeon guides for all the Shadowlands dungeons, so keep an eye out for those. You can also follow me on Twitter for updates, or check me out on Twitch, both at Tactics. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.